Everyone that's listening, just to give you some context, our moms have been friends forever, and William actually used to babysit me, and never in a million years did I think we would be on a podcast talking about astrology, but life is weird, and here we are.
I was thinking about how I remember holding you as a baby, actually.
That's crazy. So, for those who are listening that you just like don't really know much about astrology, can you just kind of give us a quick overview of how this works, or if there's
Yeah.
anything big that you want to touch on?
Yeah. So a brief, I mean, we could talk about it for hours and hours and hours and still not get to the core of it. But a brief explanation would be it's the study of the movement of the stars and how it correlates to things happening in our lives, which is something that has been going on for centuries
Mm.
before we understood how anything worked. This is a way how a lot of uh, people, societies navigated life, and which is cool.
I'm just beyond excited about this. And I've never had a reading done, so I'm a
Yeah,
little scared as well, but
that's all right.
but yeah, if you want to share the screen and we can dive into
Yeah,
it, and then if there's anything that you want to explain like as we're going through, feel free.
all right.
Balls in your court.
So this is your birth chart. So this is essentially a snapshot of where all the planets were the moment you were born. And that's why the time is important. Now, a lot of people don't know the time they were born, but the reason it's important is because it sets up the house system. So each section here is a different house. There's 12 houses in your astrological chart. The first house is always dictated. That's how we know what time. So, all right, so you were born at 2:18 a.m. And that means that at that time, Leo was the rising sign on the eastern horizon at that moment. And so that's what sets up your rising sign. When I look at an astrology chart, the main things I look at are the sun, the moon, and the rising. And those are the ones you hear about the most. People like to call them the big three. Um, you can get a lot out of just looking at the big three and nothing else. So you can get
Mm.
a lot of information. And so those are the things I tend to focus the most on when I'm looking at someone's chart, depending on what it is we're looking at. If we're just giving a reading for someone who's never had a reading before, then I would probably mostly focus on those, and then some other things, core things like, for instance, you have what we call a stellium, which is when you have a whole bunch of stuff all lined up in one place. That would be called stellium. So you have a Scorpio stellium in your fourth house. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about what it means to have your moon in the eighth house, because that says something. I
Huh.
mean, everything says something, but just the
Right.
fact that your moon's in the eighth house, there's so many things I could speak on just on that. There's also, I mean, the deeper you get into astrology, and there's different branches, and there's different, there's more traditional astrology, which is the astrology that I tend to lean towards, just because there's so much information, and it's based on, a lot of it is really based on the astronomy of it. It tells us stuff about it. Whereas more modern astrology, um, which you can kind of put the two camps in, traditional astrology and modern astrology. Traditional was before they discovered Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. When the furthest planet out we knew of was Saturn. And so that says a lot about what Saturn represents in traditional astrology, why it represents death and kind of like the end of things, because it was the last planet. And then you get into modern astrology, which is when Uranus, then Neptune, then Pluto were discovered. And a lot of modern astrology puts things on those planets that I wouldn't necessarily put on, but they are just as important as the other planets. Just I see them differently. And we'll get into that as we go through the chart. But I just wanted to put that out there, that there is a big difference between traditional and modern. I like to mix the two. But one other thing about them is newer forms of astrology will assign Pluto, for instance, to be the ruler of Scorpio.
Yes, I was
I,
just gonna ask this. Is it
okay.
Mars or is it Pluto or is it both?
A lot of people would say both. A lot of
Okay.
people would say Pluto. I personally say Mars. When you really get into the nitty gritty of it, it just makes more sense,
Okay.
and you can just expand on it more, I think, than with just Pluto. Um, I just see like the outer planets, as we'll call them, uh, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, as they're kind of like, well, they're more generational because they stay in signs much longer, whereas the planets, the inner planets, so like the seven traditional, and we say we include the sun and the moon as planets in astrology when they're not, we know when they're not planets, and we know that Pluto isn't a planet anymore, but we still talk about it like it is in astrology. The inner planets are more personal and they tend to be more about like human things, and then like human everyday things. And then the outer planets, to me, they seem to be a little bit more um, about the collective, about like things happening more on a bigger scale
Yeah.
than the everyday type things. So Pluto makes sense to some degree as a ruler of Scorpio, but it only goes so far, in my
Mm.
opinion. So that's my little spiel about.
I'm already learning so much.
Awesome. Well, let's get into actually talking about your chart then. What the sun, moon, and rising signs represent. So the sun in astrology is kind of like your spiritual battery. That's the way I see it. It's kind of who we are at our core, for better or worse. Um, it's when we shine our brightest, it's who we are. Um, so I think of a lot of the metaphors around like shining and bright and so, because it's the sun. And that's another thing about astrology that's really important to understand is it's all about metaphor and the importance of metaphor, understanding metaphor and seeing metaphor in life. Like that's really what astrology is. And it's everywhere around us.
Yeah.
So it's understanding what all those other meanings can be. So the sun is our light, our battery. It can also sometimes represent the father or like an authoritative figure in our life. But on a more personal level, it's our soul, it's our battery, it's this kind of spiritual core. And then you have your rising sign, which is the vehicle with which the solar light operates. The rising sign is very much about you and you only. It's very much about your body, about you as a person. It's about like the different ticks and things we have, the way we move through the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's kind of how we see things. Um, and then the moon is the connective tissue. It's our animal body. It's our animal mind. It's our emotional core. It's our survival. It's our kind of our animal survival instinct. It's the thing that's very innate to us. And the moon is also very much related to our mother and the lineage of our mother. So anyway, yeah, so that's kind of like the sun, moon, and rising sign, the way I feel they're all connected. Scorpio is a fixed water sign ruled by Mars. So what does that mean? Fixed water sign. So water is related to emotions and intuition. Being a fixed sign, fixed is so you have your cardinal signs, which are the signs that start a season. You have your fixed signs, are the signs that are in the middle of a season. And then you have your mutable signs, which are the signs that are when seasons are changing. And so you can think about what that means for a person. Cardinal sign people tend to be more self-starters, be the first to volunteer, that they want to start things. They might not be the best at finishing things. Whereas a fixed sign, where it's like the middle of a season, it's about maintaining and keeping things going and endurance. Fixed energy is very you want to get to the root of something.
Mm.
Scorpio, so at your core, and also this can speak to this Scorpio stellium in the fourth house because it's that there's this heavy Scorpio energy in your chart. I also have a Scorpio stellium, by the way, so I know a lot about the heavy Scorpio energy. Um, Investigative, really into getting to the core of something.
Yeah.
Scorpios don't really like bullshit. They don't like small talk. They want to get straight into like They don't want to talk about the weather. Like, tell me about what happened to your mother. They care about that stuff and they want to get right into it. This is the perfect avenue for a Scorpio stellium, is having this investigative podcast.
Can't stop, Billy.
It's great and you're good at it. I mean, again, this speaks to like innate things that you're just good at. That's kind of how I see the sun sign is like, for better or worse, these are natural abilities that we have that we can shine. Things that Scorpios, like careers that Scorpios tend to get into, things like therapy, therapists, like being a therapist, helping people get to the root of their problems. Um, Doctors, surgeons. And a lot of that is because Scorpios, people with heavy Scorpio placements tend to have a lot of heavy stuff that have happened to them in life. Like you're just handed heavy stuff, and that makes you stronger and have a thicker skin, and you're aware of like the darkness of life earlier on. Yeah, so that's something that I would say about Scorpios. Another thing with it being in the fourth house. So the fourth house is related to home, and it's related to home and foundation, both literally and figuratively. So the idea of home, your home is fourth house stuff. Things happening in the fourth house are going to be related to your home. When you have a lot of planets in the fourth house, it means you like to be home. You tend to, sometimes you can work from home, or you prefer to work from home if you can, or things happen at home, right? Like there's some people that are like, need to be out and about in the world in order to experience life. And it doesn't mean, I mean, everyone should leave their house, obviously.
Right.
But it means that you could get a lot done at home and you're
Yes,
comfortable
very
there. You
productive. Yeah.
really nest. Yeah. And it just also speaks to, because it's foundational stuff, um, people with heavy fourth house placements also really are into things like self-improvement,
Mm.
meditation, things that are, you know, help us become better versions of ourselves. We care a lot about that stuff, and we have a lot of placements in the fourth house.
Interesting.
Would you say any of that stuff rings true?
All of that, all of it. Fascinating.
Yeah. So now your rising sign, which is the one sign that really only represents you, whereas everything else can be about you, but it also represents other stuff. The rising sign is really all about you. That first house is really about you. So you're a Leo rising,
Huh.
meaning that while you're a Scorpio, that scorpionic light that you have operates through a Leo rising. Leo risings are, first off, it is a fire fixed sign. So fixed fire. So similar to Scorpio in the ability to, like, when you get into something, like you really, really stick with it, but it's a fire sign. So fire sign, the difference between fire and water. So water is more emotionally based. Fire is much more like passion and inspiration and action. So,
Huh.
where Scorpio in itself might not be as ambitious, a
Mhm.
Leo rising is going to be a lot more ambitious. Um, yeah.
Are you seeing like from the time you're born, are you seeing the rising sign come out like as you get older? Is that or are you seeing
Yeah.
that all times? Am I making sense?
No, you're totally making sense. And it's interesting. There's a lot of different thoughts on it. I've heard some astrologers say that you grow into your rising sign as you get older. Um, and then I've heard others say that like you're always the rising sign, but or people that know you best or the rising signs. It's weird. I've seen both. I don't know. I think it all depends. It all depends. Everybody's
Yeah.
personality is different. How we display it is different. We might display different aspects. But I do think there's something to be said for growing into our rising sign as we get older, especially the more positive, because like every sign has, I think I like to think of it more as higher vibration, lower vibration.
Yes,
It's
absolutely.
easier, you know what I mean? It's better
Hmm.
saying something like that than like positive and negative. And especially someone with a Scorpio stellium knows that lower vibration energy sometimes is just necessary.
Yes, absolutely.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean? There's a reason it exists.
Yes,
We just
yes.
don't want to be there all the time, you know?
Right. Yes.
So, because like, okay, so Leo rising, high vibration stuff would be loyalty. Leo risings are very loyal and they're very protective, very, like a lioness, very protective of the people they care about, their loved ones, the things they care about. They're very passionate about that. Uh, they also, there is, and it's a stereotype with Leos, is they tend to do very well on a stage, or they're naturally comfortable maybe in front of a camera or being put on the spot. They can be charming very easily without having to do the work, as maybe some other people might freeze up. There's just this natural thing. I've met a lot of podcasters who are Leo risings, who are the ones that are really good at it, the ones that are good at connecting with people and just kind of having that natural charm with on a stage or a platform. So it makes sense that you would be naturally good at doing this.
Interesting.
So yeah, Leo risings. Yeah, so you move through life as like there's a charisma with Leo risings. There's a charm with Leo risings, and then I guess the lower vibration stuff, really I would put in with that fixed, any fixed rising sign can be stubborn, can be harder to change something. You have to be sometimes forced into it a little bit.
For sure.
Being really headstrong about your position on something. Yeah. Another thing, though, also that's interesting about Leos in general is there's this uh, attachment to a time when, and so they tend to romanticize the past, which can be a good thing. And all Leo placements have that to an extent, just depending on what it is.
Interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
I do tend to do that, but it's also funny because I don't know if this is like a recent thing or what, but I'm like more than okay with like us running far away from the past.
That's
That's
good.
just where
Well,
I am right now. But yeah, I do tend to look back and just like I tend to forget about the negative things and I do over romanticize like the positive things for sure. Yeah.
which is an okay thing to have to an extent, right? Like we need to have that a little bit. Because
Yeah.
there's some people that only look at the past and think of all the negatives, and that's not good
Right.
either.
Right.
It's interesting you talked about wanting to kind of separate yourself from it lately, because that's something I was going to get in after we get into your chart. I was going to go into a couple things of the astrology happening to your chart right now,
Awesome.
and that speaks to that.
Okay. Interesting.
So yeah, so that's the rising sign in a nutshell. The next would be the moon sign. So this to me is the most fascinating part of your chart. Your moon. You have a moon in Pisces. Pisces is, in traditional astrology, is ruled by Jupiter. In modern astrology, it's ruled by Neptune. And it makes sense on both. Uh, I can see why it would be related to Neptune, but again, I don't feel like it tells the full story. Jupiter gives a fuller story. So Pisces is a mutable water sign. And but yeah, mutable. Okay, so we talked a lot about fixed signs, but mutable signs, when it's a mutable sign, one way you can think of it is, the seasons are changing. There, I guess an easy way to think of mutable is you're more adept at change, or you're used to things changing, and so it's easier for you to pivot. But I don't know that that's necessarily true so much. Sometimes it can be um, not so much easier to pivot, but you're used to things changing, right?
Yes.
So it's
Yeah.
like it doesn't mean that you're
Yes.
doesn't mean that it feels good, right? I know because I have a lot of mutable in my chart, and I think I get anxiety around change, but I'm used to it happening. It doesn't mean that it necessarily makes me better at it, right?
I don't tend like knowing that I'm gonna go into change doesn't really excite me, but once I'm there, I tend to adapt very quickly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. See,
Yeah.
there you can see kind of like your sun, moon, and rising signs working together, right? You have a lot of
Yeah.
fixed energy, but at your core, that emotional, animal body is mutable. So you go with the flow because
Yes.
when it comes down to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the moon sign is about our emotional core. It's also about intuition. And there's no sign more intuitive than Pisces. You could even say it's the most psychic sign of them all. Um, and especially in the eighth house. The eighth house is related to, it's one of what we call the hidden houses. It's related to things you can't see. It's related to death, rebirth. It's related to our kind of hidden um, entanglements with others.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have a moon in Pisces in the eighth house, I mean, I would say, well, this is a psychic person or someone who has the ability to be psychic. So I don't know.
That
Hard.
makes total sense. It's funny you say that about Pisces because I hear a lot that Scorpios are one of the most intuitive, but I'm assuming are water signs in general more intuitive?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. Someone with all of Cancer in their chart will also
Yeah.
be very intuitive.
Okay.
Yeah, because the water signs are Scorpio, Cancer, and Pisces.
Okay.
So really any of them. Yeah,
That makes total sense. Yeah.
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 But
My
there's something,
intuition's been pretty strong ever since I was little. It's kind of on another level recently. But yeah, it's always been there. Whether I listen to it or not is another thing, but yeah, it's
right,
always
exactly.
there.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say, because it's in the eighth house and Neptune currently is in Pisces. It's getting ready to leave Pisces. So Neptune has been in Pisces for the last 14 years. So, and this is me skipping ahead a little bit, but just because you were talking about um, more recently trying to be tapping into it or listen to it more. Because, and this is also why I think Neptune is related to Pisces. So they have a lot of things in common.
Huh.
Um, Neptune is the planet of kind of blurring the lines between life and death and what is real and what isn't real. I want to say Neptune and Pisces for the last 14 years on a collective level has been positive and negative for society. So you've seen a lot of people who are like waking up, a lot of people waking up, a lot of people becoming more spiritual, a lot of people tapping into that stuff. Um, you know, so I would say that with Neptune in the last 14 years in your eighth house, that it's been probably the last 14 years where maybe you've been taken a little more seriously, but specifically would have been, let me see where, so see right now Neptune is at 27 degrees, your moon is at 23. So really in the last 2 years would have been when you really were probably feeling the
Yes.
most like intuitive and like what is going on? What am I seeing? What am I feeling?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. Spot on. Yeah.
interesting.
Wow.
Yeah. Another thing I would say about the moon in Pisces in the eighth house um, is, and I've already talked a little bit about the moon being related to our mother's lineage. Uh, the eighth house is very much about inheritance as well.
Hmm.
So the idea of inheriting, so that makes me feel like this is very like a thing handed down. So have there been like psychics in your family, like
Yeah.
known, like on
Yeah.
the
I
mother's
I
side, and you'd say
think for
five or six?
sure we just have denied it. But yes, a
Okay.
100%. Yeah. Julie, before she passed away, she told me to read a book by Edgar Casey, who is like,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Uh-huh. I
So
love
it's
that.
there. And I used to talk to my grandma about it a little bit, and like she would give like hints into like some things that she was psychically aware of, but like we just
Never
didn't
went that
dive
far.
into it as a family. But yeah, it's there.
Well, the chart speaks to that. I mean,
Interesting.
yeah. And the fact that your Mercury, which is the planet of communication and thought process, is trining your moon. So it's connecting the mind and the body
Wow.
um, with the eighth house. And then you have the fourth house, which is also about foundation. And the fourth house is also about the parents' lineage. So there's just, yeah, it just screams psychic energy, mother lineage, all of that.
Wow. Huh.
So those are that's the sun, moon, and rising, and then other aspects. So then you have Venus. Venus is the planet of, when I think about Venus, for some reason, I don't know why, Venus of all the planets was the hardest for me to wrap my head around.
Huh.
Because when you start learning about astrology, they say things like it rules your relationships, it rules love, it also rules money, and um, I just all of that stuff. I was like, how is it all connected? And so, the way I like to think of it is this idea of called the ages of man, which is assigning the planets in order to stages of life. And that really helps me anyway, think about what that planet represents.
Huh.
So the first couple years of life is the moon, which makes sense. You're attached to the mother, everything is animal, right? It's very everything's intuition. Right? It can't be anything else when you're that small,
Yes. Huh.
right?
Uh-huh.
And then from like 3 to I don't know, like 13, 14 is Mercury, which is Mercury is the planet of communication. It's also the planet processes. So it's like learning things. It's like learning to tie your shoe, learning a language, learning to communicate, learning how to, yeah, it's all about that, like communicating and learning the basics is very Mercury. Um, and that's, up until we're like early teens. And then Venus is the planet of our teen years. When I learned that, I was like, oh, it all makes so much
That's
sense.
why it's so complicated.
Yeah, yeah, it's that. Because that's like where, when we're teens, that's like where we start to know what we care about. It's where we learn love for the first time, where we learn hate for the first time, where we start picking the types of people we want to be around. We start picking the things that we want to represent us. Um, it's almost solely, I mean, God, teens, it's also why teens are so horrible because it's all about I like this and I hate that. I mean, that is what the teen years are. But that's what Venus is. Venus is the planet of I like this and I hate that.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, it speaks to the types of relationships we find ourselves in. It speaks to the types of art we're attracted to. It speaks to maybe how our appearance, the things that we like to dress. Um, it's what we like and what we don't like. And there, yes, there's gray in between that, but that's really what Venus represents, if that makes sense. But you
That
can
makes
see
sense.
how it's like a minefield in a way, but
Yeah.
it's not.
Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So your Venus is in Libra, which is a great place for Venus to be because Venus rules the sign of Libra. Um, so that's about like Libra is the sign about connection. It's about, I would say, someone with Venus and Libra, maybe, especially earlier on in life, would get into relationships easily. You have maybe an instinct with like how to act in relationships. If that makes sense.
Yep.
Balance is super important. The whole like
Mhm.
stereotype of the scales. Having balance, um, but also like the Libra is very much concerned with justice.
Mm-hmm.
So fairness is super important. Um, so you would be very turned off by someone who is not displaying a sense of fairness.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
does that ring true?
Yeah, absolutely. Wow.
Yeah, and Libra also is just kind of like the quintessential sign that is interested in beauty, interested in things that are nice, things that smell nice, fashion even, just it's a really nice placement to have your Venus, especially because it's uh, home in Libra. So it's able to express itself fully to its full extent.
Okay. That
That
makes
makes sense.
sense. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then we get to Mars, which is the planet of action, of assertion. In the ages of man, though, it doesn't follow Venus. It's actually the planet that rules the 40s, which also explains a lot because so the sun in the ages of man rules over the 20s and 30s. which makes sense because that's when we have the most vitality. That's when we have
Wow.
the most energy to do all the things in the world, when we are our best selves or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And then our 40s are like things are starting to slow down and we're trying to keep up
Yeah.
with whatever it was we were doing in our 20s and 30s. And so Mars can be a lot about burnout too.
Mm.
Maybe I'm just thinking of that because I'm in my 40s now and I'm always thinking about burnout, but it's,
No, I hear you. Yeah.
your Mars being in Virgo, would say the way you approach action is very methodical. Like you need to have everything in a row, or you need things to be um, in boxes.
Hmm.
Um, planning is super, super important. And then Mercury, which we already kind of touched on a little bit. And that's Scorpio. So it's just saying that the way you process information is very scorpionic, right? So again, back to, you know, wanting to get to the truth of things, not into the BS, not into small talk and all that. So,
Yes. Yes.
and then two other things I wanted to talk briefly about before we get into what's happening with transits with the planets right now in your chart, is Saturn and Jupiter. So Saturn rules the principle of limits, whereas Jupiter represents the principle of expansion.
Hmm.
That's the way I think of them at a base level, because it can also get confusing. So the principle, all the things related to the principle of limits. So our sense of boundaries, our work ethic, all the things related to constricting, carving out discipline, that's all very Saturn. But yeah, I tend to, when I'm doing a reading, I don't tend to focus as much about what Saturn and Jupiter in those signs represent, but it is something to note. Uh,
Okay.
it's more so when you have transiting planets hitting those points.
Okay.
So with Jupiter, Jupiter being about expansion, it's about our belief system, our kind of how we learn, how we expand our lives, how we educate ourselves, how we like what we're attracted to education wise or not. Um, so this being an Aquarius, I would say it speaks to you having unconventional beliefs.
Hmm.
On a general basis, that would be what I would say.
Absolutely. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, like when things transiting. So like, if the sun is hitting your Jupiter, so that means that there's going to be themes around your belief system being highlighted. So I think about it
Makes
more
sense.
when things are transiting as opposed to what they mean by themselves, just because they mean something, but I don't, it's more interesting to me that what happens when that planet is triggered in your chart as opposed to what it might, you know what I mean?
Yes. Yes. This makes a lot of sense.
Oh, good. I'm excited that I'm actually making
This
sense.
feels spot on.
This foundational thing and family and home have been very motivating.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And even the sense of home, like what is home? I'm
Yes.
sure there have been times in your life where you're like, what even is home? Do I even
Yes.
know what that feels like?
Yes. Yes.
Will I ever know what that
Interesting.
feels like? Transiting planets. So when I'm looking at what the planets are doing right now, um, in relation to your chart, what we're looking at is things like conjunctions, which
Hmm.
is, so here's a conjunction happening right now with Uranus is conjunct your midheaven. Midheaven is not a planet, it's a point in the sky, but the midheaven speaks to our public persona. So Uranus is,
That's just confirmation.
yeah, that was just, yeah. Well, what's funny is that Uranus is about surprises and shocks and things happening out of the blue. So it's interesting. We were talking about that, and the dog started barking. It was a little surprised there,
That's hilarious.
but yeah, it just means in general around right now, or either. So Uranus has been in your 10th house since 2018 because it's been in Taurus since 2018,
Okay.
and so it has hit both your North Node and your midheaven a few times over those years as it's retrograded back and forth.
Hmm.
So I want to say it would have hit your MC, your midheaven, already a couple times last year,
Okay.
and or earlier this year, probably in the summer.
Okay. That's
Then
right
it's
when
going
I
to
moved
hit it
back.
again. I'm sorry, what was that?
That was right when I moved back.
Yeah, it was like July, June.
Uh-huh. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. It was right then. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah. So then it's going to hit again. I think I wrote it down. Yeah, it was actually May was when the last time it perfected, which is we call it perfected when
Interesting.
it's right on there. And then it's gonna hit it again in January and February.
Okay.
Yeah. And so what that speaks to is just like change, big change.
Hmm.
Doesn't necessarily mean shocking. It might seem shocking to other people, or it might seem surprising to other people, whatever it is that changes. And that's just like a big shift change in your personal life that could be career. Often the midheaven is related to career,
Okay.
so it could be related to work. Maybe you get offered something and it means you got to move, or something that's just something that shakes things up.
I can already kind of see the beginning of this playing out. So this makes total sense.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So
Total.
I was gonna say whatever it is probably something you're already kind of aware of. It's probably
Yeah.
already been slowly happening, or
Yeah.
maybe not slow at all. It's the other thing. You're full of surprises, so it could be something that happens overnight or something that you have an idea of.
Okay. This
Yeah.
makes sense. Okay.
Yeah. So that is one big thing happening in your chart right now. Another one is Pluto. So when I look at transiting planets, the ones that are the biggest, that are the most life changing, are going to be the three outer planets:
Okay.
so Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. So I always look at those first to see what are they doing in the chart, how are they aspecting the chart, because those are going to be the biggest life shifts. When it
Okay.
comes to all the other ones, they're notable and they are important, but they're smaller changes compared to what the outer planets bring. And you've got something going on with all three.
Awesome.
So we already talked about Neptune previously, about how that was affecting your eighth house. Um, and when a planet is an outer planet, that's these slower moving generational planets, are slowly kind of moving through a house. What they're really doing is they're kind of renovating all the topics of that house.
Huh.
So really, since 2018, your 10th house is being renovated. Uh, 10th house is related to who you are in the world, but it's career, it's how you present yourself in the world.
That makes sense.
So yeah. So
Hmm.
yeah. So Uranus has been coming through that 10th house and kind of changing things up, making things maybe, shocking some people that maybe are expecting you to be a certain way. I don't know. That those
Shocking
are
only everybody.
for everybody. And then Neptune has been going through your eighth house, which, we talked about being related to the things that we can't see, death, rebirth, the ties we have to others. I think that of the eighth house a lot about marriage,
Hmm.
both real marriage and metaphorical marriage, which,
Interesting.
so like the seventh house is about our relationships, and often people will get married during stuff going on in the seventh house. But then the eighth house is everything after the marriage. It's the whole like warts and all. So it's not just about the warts and all of another person, but it can be the warts and all of life, right? So since 2011, with Neptune being in your eighth house, there would be this kind of unlifting of the veil around the warts and all of life, but also maybe a marriage or a person, a relationship, or just relationships in general. Yeah,
Yeah,
that makes
spot on.
sense.
You said
Okay.
since 2011?
Yeah,
Yeah, this is spot on.
amazing. Oh, good.
Wow.
And then we have Pluto, the slowest at moving and the most transformative of all of the planets. I mean, they're all transformative, but Pluto is the loudest. Um, Pluto is the planet of Pluto is similar to the eighth house in that it kind of rules over death in a way, but it's about and death and rebirth.
Hmm.
So wherever Pluto is, it can be very much about that, like death and rebirth of whatever it's touching, right?
Okay.
And it can be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
When you're in the middle of it, it can be very uncomfortable. But it's the kind of thing that, like, on the other side, we're like,
So grateful for it.
yes, we're
Yeah.
so grateful for it.
Huh.
Yeah, and so Pluto just changed signs. Just went into Aquarius after being in Capricorn since, I guess, 2008.
Hmm.
Um, so now it's just gone into your seventh house, and it's going to be there for the next 20 years. So one way of looking at that is that Pluto is going to be transforming all of your relationships, the way you relate to other people, partnerships. It can even be business partnerships, right? So like you might even be getting into business, going into business with people. But then another thing about Pluto, besides the fact that it's going to be doing this in your seventh house, we have to look at the aspects it's making. So it's squaring, which square is 90 degrees. But you can also just look over. It skips over two houses and it's squaring your sun and it's getting ready to square your Pluto.
Okay.
And this is going back to what you said in the beginning, which was feeling like you want to let go of the past and you're just like ready to kind of like sever yourself from things in the
Hmm.
past and move forward. That is very much Pluto square sun. Uh,
Wow.
when you're having the Pluto square in your sun, it is, and I wrote down a few notes. Yeah, you're being challenged right now. It could be that your self-control is being challenged. Your sense of self is being challenged. Um, but it's also a very motivating transit. So it's a whenever Pluto is involved, it can be very uncomfortable. You
Yeah.
want to jump out of your skin,
Yeah.
but it's motivating you to move
Yes.
in one way or the other.
This
Yeah.
makes me feel a little bit better. Okay.
Oh, good. Totally. And another thing to think about Pluto is it's a planet of power. So there's a power dynamic happening as well. So you may be filled with a sense of power or a lack of power or a need to gain power back.
Mm.
Um, does that ring true, I
Yes,
guess? Okay.
absolutely.
Yeah, so during this transit, we could be feeling like we need to overcome something or push ourselves. Um, it's basically forcing us out of a rut. Also, because you're coming up on your Pluto square, which is very similar to already having this Pluto squaring your sun. The Pluto square is a little bit deeper. I just went through mine a couple of years ago, and I can tell you it's very much, again, in line with that idea of like, I want to get rid of who I was in the past. Pluto will remind you that you're still attached to things that you don't need to
Yes.
be attached to anymore.
Yeah.
And it
Okay.
will find its way to get you detached from whatever that is. And it can be very uncomfortable. And it can even make you come off as like seeming, especially if you're like kicking and screaming about it, you can come off seeming a little crazy at the time. I
Okay.
remember thinking that I was losing my mind when I was having mine. But when I got through to the other side of it is when I really was like, I want to be an astrologer. This makes me feel good. I don't want to do
Wow.
these things anymore. It's just like everything just became a lot more clear. My purpose
Yeah.
felt more clear.
Wow.
So
Awesome.
that's the thing to remember. about these Pluto squares and these Pluto transits is that while it's uncomfortable, you will know who you are more on the other end.
Okay. This has been fascinating. Bill,
Yeah,
I can't thank you enough. Thank you
thank you.
so
Yeah.
much.